A widow sold because she couldn't conceive, but the rancher with baby girl asked her to stay. The year was 1867, and the Wyoming territory lay raw and unforgiving beneath a sky that seemed too wide for any man or woman to ever truly tame. Dust hung heavy over the Cheyenne auction yard that morning, stirred by cattle hooves, wagon wheels, and boots that carried the weight of desperation. Men shouted prices, voices hoarse from whiskey and dust, while the clatter of chains and the crack of a whip laced the air with menace. It was a place where live were traded as casually as mules or iron pots. And today Clara found herself standing on the wrong side of that truth. She stood with her wrists bound, iron-biting skin rubbed raw from the ride into town. A black dress clung to her, faded at the seams, the same she had worn when her husband was laid in the ground. She'd never thought she would wear it again, certainly not while being offered to the highest bidder, like a broodmare. Around her, the men jeered, their laughter sharp and cruel. "What's the use of her?" One barked, lifting his hat to spit into the dirt. "She can't even give a man an heir." The insult stung no more than the truth already did. Clara lifted her chin, though the shame pressed hard on her chest. She had buried her husband, and in doing so had buried the only protection she'd ever known. His brothers had wasted little time. To them, she was a burden, a barren reminder of lost legacy. They hadn't spoken a word of kindness when they pulled her from the house she'd kept for 5 years, nor when they dragged her behind their wagon into Cheyenne. They spoke only of debt, of mouths to feed, of land that needed heirs. She had given them none, so now they meant to make her useful by selling her off. The auctioneer, a fat man with sweat staining the underarms of his vest, slapped his ledger against his palm. "Here we got a fine young widow," he barked. "Strong back, decent cook, 26 years old. Can't bear children, so don't be a skin, but she'll keep a house clean and warm a bed." Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp as knives. Clara kept her gaze steady on the horizon, on the ridge of hills that rose against the morning light. She would not let them see her cry. The bidding started low, insults woven between offers. $10. 12, 15. She might as well have been a mule with a limp. Men leaned in to sneer, some looking at her with hunger, others with nothing more than contempt. For a moment she thought no one would pay more than the cost of a rusty shotgun, and she prayed in silence that the ground might swallow her whole before one of them claimed her. Then, through the noise, a voice cut clean. 25. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that hushed the mockery. Heads turned toward a tall man, standing near the edge of the pen. His hat brim shadowed his face, but the sun caught the sharp line of his jaw, the dust of the trail still clinging to his coat. He held no whiskey bottle, made no crude jokes. His arms were strong from labor, his stance steady as an oak, and across his chest, bound in a sling of faded cloth, rested a small child. The baby stirred, a tuft of golden hair catching the light, and fussed against the man's chest. He hushed her with a hand that looked more suited for a plow handle than a cradle, his thumb rubbing gentle circles against her back. For reasons she couldn't name, Clara's breath caught. The bidding stuttered after that. A few men pushed the price higher, maybe to prove they could, maybe to see how far the stranger would go. 30, 35. Each time, the tall man's calm voice answered, pushing it higher without so much as a twitch. When it reached 50, silence settled over the yard. No woman fetched that price unless she was young and fertile, unless she promised sons and strong bloodlines. Clara was none of those things. The other bidders muttered curses and stepped back. Sold. The auctioneer bellowed, slapping his ledger shut. To Mr. Kane. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs as the chains were unlocked. Her wrists burned with freedom that didn't feel free at all. She looked at the man, Kane, and saw no triumph in his eyes, no smug claim, only a steady watchfulness, the kind a rancher might give a storm rolling across the plains. He didn't take her arm roughly, or drag her away. Instead, he nodded toward the street, as if giving her the choice to follow. With nothing else left, she did. They walked through Cheyenne, past saloons spilling music and laughter, past the blacksmith hammering sparks into the air. Clara kept pace beside him, the weight of curious stares heavy on her shoulders. She wanted to ask why he had done it, why he had paid more than she was worth. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she watched him soothe the child when she whimpered, saw the way his rough hand became soft at her cry. Finally, on the edge of town, she found her voice. "Why?" she asked, the word low but sharp with need. "Why by me?" Cain adjusted the sling, his eyes on a road that stretched into the open prairie. "Not for the reason you think," he said, and nothing more. The trail to his land was long, the hours filled with creak of saddle leather and the hush of wind through the grass. Clara rode behind him on a weary mare, her mind a storm. Every time the baby cried, Cain dismounted, held her close, and calmed her with a patience Clara hadn't known men could carry. Something shifted in her chest each time, though she shoved the feeling down, afraid to name it. By dusk, the land rose into view. The ranch sprawled against the horizon. Fences broken, corral half standing, the house sagging against years of storms. It was no grand homestead, no empire cattle. It was hard land, the kind that demanded blood and sweat and gave little in return. Cain dismounted, unstrapped the child, and led Clara toward the house. "You'll have a room," he said. His voice was even, almost weary. "There's food in the cellar. Work enough for two, more than enough for one. I don't need a wife." His eyes flicked to hers, steady and clear. "I need someone who won't run when it gets hard." The word struck deeper than any insult had. He wasn't asking for her womb, nor her obedience. He was asking for her strength. And she realized, standing there in the fading light with the cry of coyotes rising from the hills, that she still had some left to give. Inside the house, the air smelled with smoke and dust. A cradle rested near the hearth, patched together from spare boards. Cain laid the baby down, tucking a quilt around her with surprising gentleness. Clara stood uncertain by the door, the weight of the day pressing until her knees trembled. "Eat," Cain said, setting a plate of bread and beans on the table. He didn't touch her, didn't demand thanks, only turned to bank the fire. Clara sat, the warmth of food filling a hollow that had yawned wide since her husband's death. She looked at the child, tiny chest rising and falling in sleep, and something stirred in her that she thought had been buried forever. She felt the ache of loss, but also the faintest flicker of hope. That night, as the prairie wind rattled the shutters and the moon silvered the broken fences outside, Clara lay on a narrow cot in her new room. She stared into the dark, listening to the baby's soft breathing through the wall. She had been sold like cattle, cast off by blood, claimed by a stranger. But here, in this rough place at the edge of the world, she felt a tremor of possibility. The narrator's voice lingers in silence, heavy with reflection. Out here, worth wasn't always measured by sons or land or coin. Sometimes it was measured by the will to endure. Clara had thought she'd been shackled to a new chain, but she began to see something different. She had been brought to a place where survival might just rewrite her fate. And as the coyotes cried into the night, Clara closed her eyes, knowing tomorrow the work would begin. Knowing, too, that for the first time in a long while, she wanted to see what tomorrow might hold. Clara woke to the sound of coyotes howling across the plains, their cries carrying like ghosts in the thin dawn air. For a moment she thought she was still back in the town, bound and humiliated. But then the smell of wood smoke and the faint coo of the baby reached her. She pushed herself upright from the narrow cot, her muscles aching from work she had not yet done, and stared at the cracked plaster ceiling of Ethan Kane's ranch house. It was not comfort that greeted her here, but it was not cruelty either, and that made it something she had not known in some time. The days settled into rhythm quickly, though every step felt like testing ground beneath her boots. She rose early to stoke the stove, learned where Cain kept the flour and beans, where the spring trickled past the edge of the house, where the fences sagged and cattle pushed through gaps. The land was as battered as the man who worked it, yet he bore it without complaint. Clara watched him as he mended posts, his shirt clinging with sweat, his face hard with concentration. He said little, but his silence was not the silence of disdain. It was the silence of a man who had learned words didn't fix broken rails or quiet a child's cry. Rosie became her tether. The baby reached for Clara with small hands sticky from porridge, clung to her skirts with trust that both pained and softened her. Every smile the child gave seemed to mock what Clara had lost, Yet it warmed her all the same. At night, when Ethan read aloud from a battered Bible or sharpened tools by the fire, Clara found herself holding Rosie longer than needed, as though drawing something from the child's steady breath. Still, the world beyond their walls had sharp teeth. Men in town whispered about the widow bought at auction, about Cain spending good money on barren stock. The laughter carried even into Mercantile, when Clara went for flour, the merchant's wife staring at her with pity. She ignored it, though the words cut deep. Ethan said nothing of it when he noticed her tight jaw on the ride back, but his hand brushed the baby's back, and his eyes flickered toward her with something close to understanding. Trouble did not come first from laughter, but from land. The Cain Ranch bordered that of Harlan Briggs, a man whose fortune was built on hard whiskey and harder fists. Briggs had always wanted Cain's property, its water rights, its grazing ground. With Ethan tied down by a child and land too much for one man, Briggs saw an opportunity. He rode up one afternoon with 3 of his men, their horses kicking dust, their pistols gleaming in sunlight. Clara was hauling water when she saw them approach, her arms straining with the weight of the bucket. She set it down, straightened her back, and met their eyes. Briggs was a thick man with a beard gone gray, his grin wide as a wolf's. "Afternoon, Cain," he called. "Heard you brought yourself a wife. Can't say I figured you for charity." His gaze flicked to Clara, crawling across her like ants. Ethan stepped from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've no business here, Briggs." Briggs chuckled. "Business is all I got. Your fences are down, your cattle straying. Won't be long before this land's mine by right of abandonment." His men laughed, their hands resting easy on their guns. "You'd best think on selling before someone gets hurt." Clara stood still, her heart hammering, but Ethan didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his voice steady. "This land will feed my girl long after you're gone to dust. You ride on now." Briggs sneered but tugged his reins, turning his horse. "Suit yourself, Cain. But when the wolves come knocking, don't say I didn't warn you." Dust rose behind them as they rode off, leaving silence heavy as stone. Clara felt Ethan's eyes on her, but he said nothing. She understood. This was not finished. That night, fear gnawed at her while the baby slept. She had seen men like Briggs before, bullies with land enough to buy the law, cruelty enough to break what they couldn't buy. But when she glanced at Ethan, scarred knuckles resting against his jaw as he sat by the fire, she also saw something unyielding. It was not bravado. It was grit, the kind that kept a man on his feet when the storm wanted him down. The storm came soon enough. It was past midnight when Clara woke to the sound of glass shattering. She jolted upright, heart clattering in her chest, as a scream split the night, Ethan's cattle bellowing in panic. She heard boot steps outside, a horse's whinny, then the crack of a gunshot. Rosie stirred, whimpering in her cradle. Clara snatched the child up, her body trembling, the baby pressed tight against her chest. The door burst inward and a shadow lunged inside. Clara backed toward the corner, eyes wide, until her hand struck something leaning against the wall, a rifle, tall and heavy. She'd never fired one, but instinct clawed harder than fear. She raised it, aimed clumsily at the intruder, and pulled the trigger. The blast deafened her, the recoil nearly knocking her over. Smoke filled the room, and the man crumpled, clutching his shoulder, blood slicking through his fingers. Ethan stormed in then, his revolver barking twice, dropping another raider in the yard. He was bleeding from a cut across his forehead, his shirt torn, but his eyes blazed with fire. "Stay down," he barked, before charging back into the night. Clara crouched by the cradle, Rosie pressed her chest, listening to the chaos outside, the sharp staccato of gunfire, the shouts, the guttural moans of cattle stampeding through broken fences. Time lost meaning. She didn't know if minutes or hours passed before silence finally fell, broken only by the crackle of fire. When Ethan returned, his face was pale, blood staining his sleeve, but he was alive. He set his revolver down, leaned heavy against the wall, and looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, his voice broke. "You saved her," he whispered, nodding toward Rosie. Clara felt her knees give, tears burning her eyes. "I was afraid." "You acted," he said firm. "That's more than most would have done." She wanted to protest, to tell him she had only been desperate, that it wasn't bravery but terror. But his gaze held her still. There was no scorn in it, no doubt, only respect, the kind she hadn't known since her father's hand had guided hers at a plow as a girl. It undid her, and the tears came hot and unbidden. She helped bind his wounds with trembling hands, each touch drawing her closer to a man she realized she barely knew, but had already begun to trust. In his silence, she felt steadiness. In his pain, she saw resilience. And when Rosie reached for her that night, curling tiny fingers around hers, Clara felt something she hadn't in years. Purpose. The raiders left scars. Fences burned, cattle scattered, a body buried out back beneath hard soil. But in the smoke's aftermath, something else had taken root. Clara was no longer the woman cast off at auction, no longer the barren widow shamed by whispers. She was a fighter, bound not by chains but by choice, by the strength she approved when the night demanded it. Ethan saw it too. His words were few, but one evening as they sat by the fire, his arm bound in sling, he said, "You've got more fight in you than most men I know." The words lodged deep in her chest, heavier than any vow. She stared into the flames, her hand resting over Rosie's small body, and felt her old life slip further behind her. The days that followed were hard, each one a test. Repairs demanded sweat. Cattle needed rounding, and neighbors whispered louder about Cain's feud with Briggs. But now Clara walked the yard with her shoulders straighter, her eyes sharper. She was no longer waiting for ruin to claim her. She was standing against it, even daring to believe she could hold it back. And when the coyotes howled again in the distance, she did not shiver. She listened, had lifted, as though daring them to come closer, for she was not merely surviving anymore. She was becoming something stronger. The narrator's voice rose in quiet reflection as the fire burned low that night. Under the gun's smoke and blood, a truth had taken root. She was no longer a woman discarded. She was the heart of a home worth fighting for. And though the horizon promised storms yet to come, Clara Cain, once soul and shamed, now knew she would not run when it got hard. Snow came early that winter, sweeping down from the northern hills and blanketing the Cain ranch in silence. The wind rattled through the cottonwoods, howling against the eaves, but inside the house Clara moved with steady purpose. She had learned the rhythm of the place, the stubborn pulse of life on the frontier. Each morning she tended to Rosie, bundled tight in quilts by the fire, before hauling water and splitting kindling. Ethan worked as much as his shoulder allowed, but the wound from the raid still stiffened him. She had become his right hand, and though the work blistered and bent her, she carried it with pride. Yet peace in Wyoming was never more than a lull between storms. Harlan Briggs had not forgotten the slight, nor forgiven Ethan for defying him. Clara sensed in the way neighbors avoided their eyes in town, in the muttered talk that stopped when she entered the mercantile. Briggs was waiting, circling like a wolf around a wounded elk. One evening, when the firelight flickered low, a hard knock rattled the door. Clara opened it to find Briggs himself standing there, snow dusting his shoulders, a smirk carving his bearded face. Behind him loomed two of his men, their hands resting on their pistols. "Evening, Mrs. Cain," Briggs drawled, though the title was mockery. His eyes roamed past her to where Ethan sat at the table, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. "Looks cozy in here. Shame if that warmth were snuffed out." Clara tightened her grip on the doorframe, but Ethan's voice came calm, steady. "Say your piece, Briggs." Briggs stepped inside, uninvited, the smell of whiskey rolling from him. "My piece is this. You're a cripple with a half-dead ranch. Sell to me while you still can. I'll even take your woman off your hands. Lord knows she deserves better than a freeze beside a man who can't keep what's his." The insult cut sharp, but Clara held Briggs's gaze. She saw what he wanted, fear, submission. She gave him none. "I'd rather freeze," she said, her voice iron. Something flickered in Briggs's eyes, a flash of anger that curled his lips. "You got fire, I'll grant you that. But fire burns out quick when the wood's gone." He leaned close enough that Clara caught the rot of his breath. "Think on it. You've got a choice. Leave him, come with me, and live. Or stay here and die with him when I take this land." He turned, stomping snow onto the floorboards, and left as sudden as he'd come, the wind rushing behind him, chilling the room long after the door was closed. For a long while, the only sound was Rosie's quiet breathing from her cradle. Then Ethan set the knife aside and looked at Clara. His face was worn, shadowed with pain, but his eyes were clear. "He'll come back," he said, "with more men, more guns." Clara crossed the room, kneeling beside him. "Then we stand ready." He studied her, as though weighing the truth of her words. "This isn't your fight. It became mine the day you brought me here," she said. And in her chest, she knew it was more than that. This ranch was the first place she had been more than a burden, more than barren stock. It was the first place she had been needed. She would not yield it, not to Briggs, not to anyone. The days that followed carried a tension thick as storm clouds. Clara patched fences, gathered ammunition, even learned the weight and pulled Ethan's rifle. He showed her how to brace it, how to breathe steady before squeezing the trigger. At night, when Rosie slept, they talked in hushed tones, of cattle, of land, of the things worth dying for. Ethan spoke little of his past, but Clara caught glimpses in his words, in the way he looked at Rosie. His wife had died in childbirth, leaving him with a ranch on the brink and a daughter barely clinging to life. Everything he did was for Rosie, every breath, every drop of sweat. Clara understood. She had no child of her own, but in that baby's laugh, in her small hands gripping hers, she felt the ache of what might have been softened by the gift of what was. The attack came at dawn. The first sound was the thunder of hooves, rolling across the frozen ground like an avalanche. Clara jolted awake, heart hammering, as shouts carried to the cold air. She rushed to the window and saw them, Briggs and a half-dozen riders, guns gleaming, faces grim with hunger for conquest. "Get Rosie," Ethan ordered, already reaching for his revolver. Clara snatched the child from her cradle, wrapping her tight against her chest. Fear clawed at her, but she pushed it down. There was no room for fear now. She laid Rosie in a hidden space beneath the floorboards, whispering, "Be still, little one," before pulling the hatch shut. The baby whimpered, then quieted, as though sensing the gravity of silence. Gunfire erupted, sharp cracks splitting the dawn. Clara grabbed the rifle, stepping to the doorway beside Ethan. The yard was chaos. Men riding hard, bullets sparking against stone, one torch already hurled against the barn. Flames licked the dry wood, smoke curling into the pale sky. Ethan fired, his shots precise, dropping one rider clean from the saddle. Clara lifted her rifle, braced it as he had taught her, and squeezed. The recoil jolted her shoulder, but the shot rang true, grazing a man's arm and sending him howling back. She felt no triumph, only grim necessity. Briggs bellowed above the din, his voice booming. "Burn it all. Leave nothing standing." His men surged forward, one leaping from his horse to rush the house. Clara swung the rifle like a club, the stock cracking against his skull. He fell hard, snow spraying beneath him. Her breath came ragged, her hands trembling, but she did not falter. The fight raged on, every second a blur of smoke and blood. Clara fired again, the sound deafening in her ears. Ethan staggered as a bullet tore across his side, crimson blooming against his shirt. He dropped to one knee, teeth gritted, but lifted his revolver and felt another man. Briggs himself rode close, pistol drawn, hatred burning in his eyes. "This ends now, Kane," he roared. Clara stepped forward, rifle raised, planting herself between Briggs and the house. "Not while I stand." Briggs laughed, cruel and cold. "You think you can stop me? A barren widow with nothing to her name?" Her voice cut through the smoke. "I've more to my name than you'll ever have. I've got something worth fighting for." She fired. The shot struck Briggs's shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. His pistol fired wild, missing Ethan by inches. He cursed, clutching the wound, and his horse reared, carrying him back toward his men. Ethan rose, blood on his lips but fire in his eyes. "You're finished, Briggs. This land will never be yours." The remaining riders hesitated, fear breaking through their fury. Their leader wounded, their numbers cut, they turned their horses and fled into the snowy distance. Briggs shouted after them, but his voice cracked with weakness, his strength spilling with his blood. At last, he too wheeled away, retreating into the pale horizon. Silence fell, heavy as the snow that drifted down. The barn smoldered, cattle bawled in the distance, but the house still stood. Clara lowered her rifle, her arms shaking, her breath ragged. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, grimacing but alive. She rushed to him, pressing her hands against his wound. "Hold still," she whispered. "You'll be all right." He caught her wrist, his grip firm despite his weakness. His eyes, clear even through pain, held hers. "I didn't buy you to save me," he said, voice rough. "I brought you here because I needed someone Rosie could look up to, and she already does." The words struck her deeper than any bullet could. For so long, she had carried the weight of being unwanted, unworthy. Now here, in the blood and smoke of battle, she felt that weight fall away. She was more than a widow, more than barren stock. She was a woman who had stood her ground, who had defended a home, who had earned her place not by birth but by choice. Together they pulled Rosie from her hiding place, the baby's eyes wide, cheeks flushed with fear. Clara held her close, tears mingling with soot on her face. Ethan reached out, brushing a hand over both of them, his expression soft despite the pain. In that moment, the three of them were bound not by blood, but by something stronger, by survival, by loyalty, by love unspoken yet undeniable. The days that followed were hard. The barn would need rebuilding, the cattle rounding, the fences mending. Briggs might return, though his defeat had cost him dearly. But Clara no longer trembled at the thought. She had weathered the storm and come through standing. The land was scarred, but it lived, and so did she. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Clara stood on the porch with Rosie in her arms. The air was sharp, the snow crunching beneath Ethan's boots as he walked toward her. He stopped beside her, silent as ever, but his presence spoke what words could not. She leaned into him, the child nestled between them, and for the first time in years, she felt not just safe, but whole. The narrator's voice lingers, reflective and firm. Out here, family was not always bound by blood. Sometimes it was forged in fire, in the grit of survival, in the choice to stand when others ran. Clara had been sold because she could not conceive, discarded as useless. Yet here she stood, mother in every way that mattered, wife in spirit if not in law, keeper of a home worth defending. The frontier tested those who walked it, breaking the weak, hardening the strong. Clara Kane, once a widow cast off the highest bidder, had found her worth not in what she lacked, but in what she gave, the strength to endure, the courage to fight, and the love that turned strangers into family. And as the wind swept cold across the plains, carrying the scent of smoke and snow, her story whispered to all who would listen, that the hardest land to grow the fiercest roots, and the loneliest heart could still find a place to belong.